Well, good evening. It's Wednesday evening. We are into the month of March already. Well, some may seem like already, others may not quite so, but glad you could join. If you're watching later on, thank you for doing so and taking some time out of this evening. We're doing a survey as we go through the book of through the books of the Old Testament. We are at our 27th book from the front, and that would be the book of Daniel. So, trust you can join me tonight as we look at some verses, some thoughts, and as we do a quick survey through this book. So we're looking at Daniel, and the one that, of course, is after the book, and one who was brought into exile with many others. Jeremiah would have been one, as we saw with Ezekiel. He would have been another, and so on. So some other minor prophets through that time with that invasion of Babylon. So as we look at the writing time would be around 536 to 530 BC, somewhere in there. And of course we find familiar stories or accounts in this book. Daniel purposing not to partake of the king's meat. We find Daniel in the lion's den. We find his three friends, the Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The Hebrew names would be Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Uh, would have been their names. They, of course, faced the fiery furnace. And so we have a number of these. Plus, if we go through the book, which we'll talk about here in just a minute, we have Daniel prophesying of things in the future to him. Everything would be in the future. First of all, the Messiah coming, but also the 70 weeks of Daniel, the 70th week of Daniel. And as we look at the future yet into, of course, with the book of Revelation and so on, what is yet to come. After we find God dealing with the nation of Israel. So as we look at the prophecies that are in the book of Daniel, and many of them, of course, he probably didn't understand, and of course, some things that we may not fully grasp, but certainly God giving us a brief look, at just a tiny glimpse in what is yet to come to, I believe that we are to be motivated to serve, and of course, being faithful. So some events or some accounts that we find here in the book of Daniel would have been King Belshazzar seeing his invisible hand on the wall. The three friends face a fiery furnace. Daniel in the lion's den. Nebuchadnezzar, of course, having a vision that no one could understand, and so he was brought before, and so on. So we find, even though they were brought in exile from Israel or Judah, there are those who would remain faithful, and not everyone yielded to or were going the way of the gods. So a couple of verses that I want to look at here in Daniel. Let's go to chapter 12 to start us off, look at a few more thoughts. But Daniel 12, 1 and 2. And at the time did Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was, since there was a nation even to this the same time. And that the time thy people shall be delivered, everyone shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall wake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And so here we find the events that are to take place, and of course, in that time, this time of trouble, such as never was. Of all the events that have taken place in our world, and the events, the time of trouble that have plagued this world, what an amazing statement as Daniel gives through prophecy of what is to come. Chapter points about this book. Daniel was a teenager, estimated to be a teenager when he was deported to Babylon, and with many others in the great exile. Of course, we read Jeremiah would have gone, Ezekiel would have gone, I think Haggai would have gone as well. We'll get to that in the future yet as we look at the minor prophets. As we look at chapter 1, especially, we see his faithfulness, wisdom, and education enabled King Nebuchadnezzar to understand that there was a God of Israel, and who is the God of all things. And of course, we know even with the fiery furnace again, and so on. The chapters in Daniel are thick and focused, many giving details, of course, of what is yet to come. The first six chapters are history and include all the events listed above. In chapter 7, the book marks a turn and becomes prophecy about the future and of what is going to come. And we're going to look at that more in depth here in just a moment. So looking at some of the events taking place, and of course, as we mentioned, the writing of the time of Daniel, around 535, give or take BC, and Nebuchadnezzar in 605 BC had invaded, conquered Judah, some besieging and so on that took place, and deported many of its inhabitants, would have deported those that had good education, and some of those. And Daniel, of course, was included, his three friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or as by Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel served in the royal court of Nebuchadnezzar, and several rulers followed Nebuchadnezzar. And the book of Daniel records the actions, prophecies, and visions of Daniel that was given to him. So looking at some more verses, let's do that in chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. We're going to go back right to the beginning. And let's look at 19 and 20. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. When they're talking about standing before the king, not just simply in his presence from time to time, but they would have been in the court. They would have been advisors and so on, being continually before the king. So pretty amazing. In verse number 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So here we find an amazing testament as Daniel stood for right and what he knew God wanted him to do. God blessed him in this event. Chapter 2 and 31, we find a verse here as well. I want to read for you. Thou, O king, sawest, and behold, a great image. The great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. Now, the word terrible, we have in our understanding and perception our day would be awful, no good, really horrible. But here in this, the word describes as awesome, or majestic, is the understanding here of this word. Chapter 3, in verse 17 and 18. Let's go there if we could. Verses 17 and 18. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. Nebuchadnezzar had this idea that everyone should worship, and so built this big idol and so on, and at the sound of music playing, people would fall down and worship. Well, if you stood while everybody else knelt down or bowed down to worship, you'd stand out quite obviously. So, which, of course, if you know the account, they did. They were brought before, and I don't believe they did it in a disrespectful manner. I believe that they were respectful and honoring to the king's authority, but they just made it clear that God forbid them to worship an image and that they would obey God. And you notice in those two verses, they said, we're not going to. And if you decide to throw us in the fiery furnace, which they heated at 7 times than was wont to be heated, or needed to be, they said, if God delivers us, great. If not, we're still not gonna bow. So quite an amazing determination, a testament of obeying the Lord. Chapter 4, verses 34 and 35. Chapter 4, verses 34 and 35. And at the end of the days, Nebuchadnezzar lifted up my eyes unto heaven, and my understanding returned unto me. This is after he grew claws and feathers and lived in a field and ate grass for, I think, 7 years. And I blessed the Most High, and I praised and honored him that liveth forever, whose dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing, and he doth according to his will in the army of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say unto him, what doest thou? What in the world are you doing? That's what he says, what no one can say to God. And so he's going to purpose all that he wills, and he will accomplish it. So chapter number 9 and beginning of verse 25. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem unto the Messiah and the Prince shall be 7 weeks. In 62 weeks the street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And for the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood. Unto the end of the war desolations are determined. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week. In the midst of the week shall he cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. For the overspreading abomination shall he make desolate, even until the consummation that is determined to be poured out upon the desolate. Like, what in the world? It's talking about what is yet to come. And Messiah being cut off, of course, we know that Christ was crucified for the sins of the world. And of course, he's talking of prophecy and a Messiah. Now, remembering again, the scriptures, majority of the scriptures are written to the nation of Israel, or because of the nation of Israel, that God had established as his people to show to the world who he was. So the majority of the scriptures, the Gospels and so on, for the Jewish people. And yet we find as a nation they rejected the Messiah. And so we find God now opening up to the Gentiles, as Paul said, we're grafted in. But yet we find God will once again turn his eyes and attention to his people. So as we look at the summary, chapter 1 describes the conquest of Jerusalem. We find the account of Daniel and his friends who, with their courage and desire to please the Lord, and the Lord promoted them, the Lord blessed them in that fashion. Chapters 2 and 4 records Nebuchadnezzar having a dream that only Daniel could interpret by God's wisdom, and of course of the statue with different types of, different stone and so on and so forth, and metals. And we find that God gives Nebuchadnezzar an understanding of what's to take place in the world powers that will be yet to ensue. Daniel 5 records Nebuchadnezzar's son Belshazzar misusing the items taken from the temple, and we find a message written on a wall. In chapters 8 through 12, we find visions, including a ram, a goat, horns, and referring again to future kingdoms and future rulers. The 70 weeks of prophecy, as we noted, and so on. And if you go into prophecy, and especially even the book of Revelation, don't forget to go back to the book of Daniel and look at that. And so, of course, we see as Daniel was would honor God in what he ate. Daniel would honor God. Remember the time of Daniel wanting to pray. He prayed faithfully. And of course, those who were against him sought to use that against him, and God protected him, even in the lion's den, and as well the 3 friends from the fiery furnace and so on. We find that God is the way of escape. But also we find that regardless if they knew they were going to be rescued, we know Daniel was going to be rescued from the lion's den. I don't believe Daniel knew that, but he was still willing to obey God. His 3 friends said, hey, if God saved us, great. If not, we're still not going to bow down and worship. They had no idea what was about to take place, but God intervened in a mighty way to bring glory to himself. And so we find that God sometimes delivers in the way that we don't expect. God works in ways that we are not always accustomed to or that we like, unfortunately, because we've got an idea of how God should work. We've got an idea how he should deliver and how he should respond and intervene. Some practical application, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we should always stand for what is right, and like Daniel as well. And God is greater than any sort of trouble or trial that can come upon us, put onto us by man, just because they do not like what we stand for, like the truth that we believe. Whether God chooses to deliver or not, he is still worthy of our trust. He's still worthy of our praise. He still knows what's best. He's still sovereign. And regardless of what the outcome may be, we need to trust and we need to obey. God has a plan, and as we read in the book of Daniel, no one can say to God, God, what are you doing? Hey, what are you up to? Let us in on it. God has a purpose, and God will purpose his will, and it will be accomplished. And that is, of course, for his ultimate goal, for his ultimate glory, so that all men will come to him. So as we look at the book of Daniel, let's look at some of the chapter breakdowns and what's contained in the chapters. We've got 12 chapters in this book. And as we see some pretty amazing accounts taking place in this book, but yet also of what is yet to come. And just a reminder for us to remain busy and do the Lord's work. So let's go through the chapters. Chapter 1, we find, of course, the Daniel and many others are taken into exile into Babylon. Chapter 2, Daniel interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream by God's wisdom. In chapter 3, we find the three fellows facing the fiery furnace and obeying God and not worshiping or bowing down to an idol. Chapter 4, Daniel interprets another dream. In chapter 5, we've got the handwriting on the wall. Chapter 6, there's the lion's den event. And then chapter 7, we find Daniel's vision of the four beasts and the interpretation involving kings and kingdom. In chapter number 8, we have the vision of the ram and the goat, and as well Daniel confirms the vision is the end of days. Chapter number 9, Daniel pleads for mercy for Israel, and the latter half to chapter 9 would be Gabriel returns with 62 sevens and other wisdom things, and an abomination of desolation referred to, of course, by Christ. Chapter 10, we find Daniel sees a terrifying vision and an angel detained by a prince of Persia, and the archangel comes along and helps. That angel that was supposed to bring the message is detained. Chapter 11, details of the end of times, kings of the north and the south, and as well the self-aggrandizing king. Chapter 12, we find details of the end times judgment in order to roll up the seals for the end times, which of course we find seals in the Revelation, but that's rolled up, and then of course the final event of the end of days that is coming. God dealing with the nation of Israel, and God has not forsaken them or forgotten them, and as we find, he will deal with them and so on. So that is another thing that we can take away from this, is that though we may sometimes feel like God has forgotten us, he has not. He has not forgotten us. He has a plan. He has a purpose. He is sovereign, and he will work out his plan for his ultimate glory. What does he want? He wants for us to trust him. He wants to have a continued relationship with us, and for us to trust him and to rely upon him and to obey him, because he desires to bless us. He wants to have that communion with us. So some wonderful accounts as we look at the book of Daniel, some great things, some encouragement that we can be reminded that regardless of the situation we're in, God still blesses obedience. And as we find that account, maybe not the way we think he does or the way he should, but God still blesses obedience. And may we be faithful and obedient to what God has commanded for us to do. Thanks for joining me. And next week, we've got the book of Hosea. We're going to some what we call the minor prophets. Hosea, of course, is an interesting events of a prophet because of what God asked him to do. Very intriguing. So I hope you can join me for that. God bless. Have a great week. We'll see you next week.